Snow drifted gently across the towering gates of Blackwood Manor, softening the sharp outlines of England's most magnificent estate beneath a silver veil. Inside, thousands of candles shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, their golden light dancing across polished marble floors, gilded ceilings, and walls adorned with portraits of generations whose names had shaped the kingdom. The annual winter masquerade was more than a celebration. It was a declaration of influence, where every invitation represented privilege and every whispered conversation carried political consequence. Coaches arrived one after another through the swirling snow, delivering dukes, duchesses, diplomats, judges, and members of parliament wrapped in velvet cloaks and jeweled masks. Servants hurried silently through endless corridors, while musicians tuned violins that would soon accompany an evening remembered for decades, though not for the reasons anyone expected. Throughout the estate, guests admired the grandeur of Blackwood Manor, yet many secretly anticipated another spectacle altogether. Rumors had traveled across London that Duke Julian Blackwood intended to make an important announcement before midnight. Some believed he would reveal a new political alliance. Others predicted an expansion of the family's estates. Only a few whispered darker possibilities, fueled by months of gossip surrounding the Duke's growing closeness with the enchanting Lady Vivian Ashcombe. No one dared speak such rumors aloud near the Duchess, whose kindness had earned affection from servants and nobility alike. Rosaline Blackwood stood alone near the grand staircase, her ivory gown flowing gracefully over the gentle curve of her 7-month pregnancy. Tiny pearls glimmered within her dark chestnut hair, arranged with understated elegance rather than fashionable extravagance. Her smile remained composed as guests greeted her, yet exhaustion lingered beneath her calm expression. She thanked every visitor personally, remembered the names of servants' children, and quietly ensured elderly guests were seated comfortably before thinking of herself. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, the elderly housekeeper who had served 3 generations of Blackwoods, watched the Duchess with silent admiration. She alone noticed Rosaline occasionally pressing one trembling hand against her unborn child whenever distant footsteps echoed through the entrance hall. The great doors suddenly opened. A cold gust swept through the ballroom, carrying snowflakes onto the polished floor as every conversation dissolved into stunned silence. Duke Julian Blackwood entered wearing a black velvet coat embroidered with silver thread, his commanding presence instantly capturing every eye. Tall, composed, and impossibly dignified, he carried himself like a man born to command armies and kingdoms alike. Yet tonight something about his expression felt unusually distant, almost determined. Beside him walked Lady Vivian Ashcombe, radiant in a crimson gown adorned with intricate lace and sparkling garnets that shimmered like drops of fresh blood beneath the chandeliers. Her delicate hand rested confidently upon Julian's arm as though she had occupied that place for years. Rosaline neither gasped nor stepped backward. She simply looked at her husband. For one fragile heartbeat, she believed he would smile apologetically, explain some misunderstanding, and cross the ballroom to stand beside her where he belonged. Instead, Julian escorted Vivian directly toward the center of the gathering. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind disturbing frozen water. Fans stopped fluttering. Crystal glasses remained suspended halfway toward waiting lips. Even the orchestra lowered their instruments. Julian raised his voice with measured confidence. "My friends," he declared, "Lady Vivian Ashcombe has accepted my invitation to reside at Blackwood Manor as an honored companion of this household. I trust she will receive the respect such a position deserves." Silence followed. Not polite silence. The terrible silence born when hundreds of witnesses struggle to believe what they have just heard. Several elderly ladies lowered their eyes in embarrassment. Gentlemen exchanged uneasy glances. Younger debutantes stared openly, forgetting every lesson of proper etiquette. Mrs. Whitmore felt her heart sink as she looked toward Rosaline, whose face remained astonishingly serene despite the devastation blooming quietly behind her eyes. Vivian crossed the ballroom with effortless elegance until she reached the Duke's table. Then, before everyone present, she deliberately settled into the chair reserved exclusively for the Duchess of Blackwood. No servant moved. No guest protested. Rosaline remained standing. Her fingers instinctively clasped the fabric covering her unborn child as though shielding the tiny life from words sharper than swords. Julian noticed none of it. Convinced he had merely established an unconventional household arrangement, he greeted diplomats and accepted congratulations from those too ambitious to challenge his authority. Vivian answered compliments with flawless charm while occasionally offering Rosaline sympathetic smiles that concealed unmistakable triumph. Hours drifted past beneath music that suddenly sounded hollow. Couples danced beneath glittering chandeliers while whispers followed the Duchess wherever she walked. Yet Rosaline neither defended herself nor confronted her husband. She thanked departing guests, comforted anxious servants, and carried herself with quiet dignity that made Julian's public decision appear even colder by comparison. Near midnight Mrs. Whitmore gently approached. "Your Grace," she whispered, tears glistening within tired eyes, "please allow me to prepare your rooms." Rosaline offered the elderly woman a faint smile. "No, Agnes." Her voice remained astonishingly steady. "Tonight I must prepare my future." Long after the final carriage disappeared and Blackwood Manor surrendered to uneasy silence, Rosaline entered her bedchamber alone. She folded only a few simple dresses into one weathered suitcase. The jewels inherited from generations of duchesses remained untouched inside their velvet cases. She left behind pearls, diamonds, silks, titles, and every privilege wealth could purchase. At the writing desk she carefully removed her wedding ring, placing it beside Julian's untouched crystal wine glass. Next to it she laid the tiny knitted baby shoes she had finished only yesterday. Finally, she wrote one quiet sentence upon a folded card. "Some homes deserve silence more than arguments." Before dawn, wrapped in a plain traveling cloak, Rosaline embraced Mrs. Whitmore one final time. Snow fell fiercely as a modest carriage disappeared beyond the manor gates, swallowed by a blizzard that erased every wheel track within minutes. When Julian awoke, the mansion felt strangely empty. He found the ring, the tiny shoes, and the note waiting beside untouched wine. As his fingers closed around the impossibly small pair of knitted slippers, a fear unlike anything he had ever known settled silently into his heart. The blizzard raged for 3 relentless days, swallowing roads, villages, and every fragile hope of finding the missing Duchess. Search parties combed frozen forests, riverbanks, and abandoned cottages until exhaustion conquered determination. Broken branches and half-buried carriage tracks offered brief encouragement before vanishing beneath fresh snowfall. By the week's end, London newspapers mourned Julian Blackwood as another noble soul claimed by winter's merciless embrace. Memorial prayers echoed through elegant churches, black ribbons adorned countless sleeves, and Blackwood Manor lowered its flags. Although no body had ever been recovered, society accepted tragedy more readily than uncertainty. It was easier to bury a story than continue searching for an inconvenient miracle. Yet the miracle refused to surrender. Far beyond the estates of England's aristocracy, Rosaline's overturned carriage lay hidden inside a snow-filled ravine. Barely conscious, weakened by cold and the strain of pregnancy, she clung to life while wrapping both arms protectively around her unborn child. At dawn, a group of villagers traveling with supplies noticed one frightened horse struggling through the drifting snow. Following the desperate animal, they discovered the shattered carriage below. Without hesitation they climbed into the ravine, carrying the Duchess through blinding wind toward their humble village. They never asked whether she possessed wealth or title. They simply saw a frightened mother fighting to survive. When Rosaline finally opened her eyes, she found herself resting beside a small fireplace inside the modest cottage of a widowed seamstress named Margaret Ellis. Warm broth simmered over glowing coals while herbs scented the quiet room with comforting familiarity. A local physician assured her that both she and the baby still lived, though she must avoid unnecessary stress if she hoped to carry the child safely to birth. Tears filled Rosaline's eyes, not because of her suffering, but because complete strangers had offered the compassion she had lost inside her own magnificent home. She learned that the world already believed her dead. Margaret gently offered to send word to Blackwood Manor, but Rosaline remained silent for a long moment before slowly shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "If I return before truth finds its own voice, nothing will change." Instead she chose another path. The villagers helped her assume the simple name Rose Hartwell, asking no questions beyond those she willingly answered. She exchanged embroidered gowns for plain wool dresses, learned to bake bread beside local women, and gradually discovered a peace untouched by titles or expectations. Months later, beneath the soft light of early spring, she gave birth to healthy twins after a long and difficult labor. The first cries of little Arthur and his sister Lillian echoed through the tiny cottage like music after endless silence. Holding one child in each arm, Rose realized that although she had lost a palace, she had been entrusted with something infinitely more precious. She devoted every waking hour to building a future worthy of them. Not far from the village stood an abandoned abbey whose crumbling stone walls had sheltered only weeds and forgotten memories for decades. Inspired by the kindness that had saved her own life, Rose envisioned something entirely different within those weathered ruins. With the help of villagers, craftsmen, and a compassionate parish priest, broken roofs were repaired, Empty halls were transformed into warm dormitories, and neglected gardens burst into bloom once more. They named it Starlight House because every frightened soul arriving there deserved to believe darkness could never extinguish every light. Women abandoned by families found refuge beneath its roof. Orphan children discovered laughter instead of hunger. Widows learned trades that restored both independence and dignity. Rose never accepted praise for herself. She insisted every success belonged to the people who chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier. Over the years, Starlight House quietly expanded until travelers spoke of it across neighboring counties. Donations arrived anonymously from merchants, physicians, musicians, and grateful families whose lives had been transformed by its compassion. Few knew the sanctuary's founder had once presided over England's grandest ballroom. While hope flourished there, shadows deepened inside Blackwood Manor. Lady Vivian settled effortlessly into the role she had always desired. She dismissed loyal servants who questioned her authority, replacing them with ambitious employees whose loyalty could be purchased. Priceless paintings vanished from gallery walls. Ancient silver disappeared from family vaults. Rare heirlooms quietly found their way into private collectors' hands through carefully hidden transactions. Whenever Julian noticed another treasured possession missing, Vivian calmly blamed dishonest staff or unfortunate bookkeeping errors. Burdened by grief and convinced his wife had willingly abandoned him, the Duke questioned little. Letters occasionally arrived addressed in unfamiliar handwriting. Vivian intercepted every one. Some contained reports from charitable organizations seeking assistance from Starlight House. Others carried heartfelt messages from villagers thanking the mysterious Rose Hartwell for changing countless lives. One by one, Vivian fed them into glowing fireplace flames before Julian ever glimpsed the names written across the envelopes. She understood that truth rarely disappeared all at once. It vanished quietly, page by page. The years altered Julian more profoundly than anyone realized. The proud young duke who had once inspired admiration became increasingly withdrawn, speaking only when duty required it. Political victories brought no satisfaction. Lavish banquets felt strangely empty. Every Christmas Eve he rode alone to the lonely stone memorial erected for Rosaline despite the absence of a grave. He placed fresh white roses beneath her engraved name, stood silently until snow covered his shoulders, then returned home carrying grief he refused to name. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore watched these rituals with an aching heart. She remembered the frightened young woman who had whispered goodbye before disappearing into the storm. She remembered the untouched jewels, the knitted baby shoes, and the quiet dignity that pride had mistaken for surrender. Deep within her room she preserved old household records, forgotten correspondence, and memories no one else valued anymore. She sensed that time possessed extraordinary patience, and that lies, however carefully woven, eventually unraveled beneath their own weight. One icy evening, as Julian prepared to leave another bouquet beside Rosaline's memorial, the oldest surviving footman stepped from the shadows with unusual determination. His weathered hands trembled, yet his voice remained steady enough to pierce 15 years of carefully protected silence. "My lord," he said softly, "I searched that road myself." He looked directly into Julian's haunted eyes. "And I never believed her grace died." 15 years transformed England in ways few could have imagined. Railways stretched across the countryside, bustling towns replaced quiet villages, and a younger generation inherited a nation eager to embrace progress. Yet some wounds remained untouched by time. Blackwood Manor still stood with majestic dignity above its rolling hills, but the laughter that had once echoed through its grand halls had long since faded. Duke Julian Blackwood had become a man respected for discipline rather than warmth. His hair carried streaks of silver before its time, and his once commanding gaze now revealed an exhaustion no title could conceal. Although society admired his service and influence, those closest to him understood that a part of the Duke had disappeared on the snowy morning his wife vanished. Far beyond the reach of London's glittering salons, another family had quietly flourished. Starlight House had grown from a humble refuge into one of England's most cherished sanctuaries for abandoned mothers and orphaned children. Its gardens bloomed with roses, lavender, and climbing ivy, while cheerful voices replaced the silence that had once haunted the abandoned abbey. Children chased one another across green lawns without fear, knowing they would never again sleep hungry or alone. At the heart of that extraordinary community stood the woman everyone affectionately called Mother Rose. Though fine lines now framed her gentle smile, Rosaline's grace had only deepened with the passing years. She wore simple dresses, tended flowers beside the youngest children, and greeted every frightened newcomer with the same quiet compassion that had once saved her own life. Her twins had become the greatest proof that love could survive unimaginable sorrow. Arthur Hartwell possessed an intelligent mind, steady hands, and a compassionate heart that drew him toward medicine. After years of rigorous study, he had become a gifted young physician whose reputation spread rapidly through neighboring counties. Wealthy patients often offered generous payment, yet Arthur accepted only what they could spare before using the remainder to purchase medicines for struggling families. His calm confidence comforted the sick long before treatment ever began. Around his neck he wore an elegant sapphire locket, explaining to curious friends that his mother had treasured it more than any possession she had ever owned. His sister Lillian had inherited entirely different gifts. Where Arthur healed broken bodies, Lillian restored weary spirits. Her remarkable talent at the piano captivated audiences wherever she performed. Newspapers praised her brilliant technique, yet listeners remembered something far more profound. Every note carried unmistakable tenderness, as though each melody told stories too beautiful for ordinary words. She donated nearly every coin earned from her concerts to Starlight House, insisting music meant little unless it eased another person's suffering. Together, the twins embodied everything Rosaline had hoped her children would become: compassionate without bitterness, successful without arrogance, and generous without expectation. Neither knew the truth about their father. Rosaline never poisoned their hearts with anger. Whenever questions arose about the past, she simply explained that some people required many years to become the individuals they were meant to be. Arthur accepted her answer with thoughtful patience. Lillian sometimes wished for greater certainty, yet her mother's peaceful expression convinced her that unanswered questions need not become lifelong burdens. The family built their happiness upon honesty, service, and forgiveness rather than resentment. Fate, however, rarely asks permission before changing lives. One autumn afternoon Julian's carriage raced along a rain-slick country road after frightened horses bolted during a violent thunderstorm. The driver struggled desperately to regain control before the carriage struck a stone bridge with tremendous force. Splintered wood scattered across the muddy road while frightened travelers rushed toward the wreckage. Julian remained trapped beneath broken timber, bleeding heavily from a deep wound across his shoulder. Many feared the aging Duke would not survive until help arrived. A young physician happened to be returning from treating patients in a nearby village. Arthur immediately hurried forward. Ignoring noble titles and anxious onlookers alike, he calmly directed strangers to lift shattered beams while he examined the injured man. Every instruction emerged with reassuring confidence. He cleaned wounds, stopped dangerous bleeding, and carefully stabilized Julian's injuries before arranging transport to the nearest infirmary. Throughout the ordeal, Arthur never recognized the distinguished stranger whose life rested beneath his capable hands. To him, every patient deserved equal devotion regardless of wealth or influence. When Julian finally regained consciousness several hours later, his eyes settled upon the physician seated quietly beside the window. Something about the young man's face stirred memories buried beneath years of grief. Arthur rose with a warm smile. "You were fortunate," he said gently. "Another hour might have changed everything." Julian thanked him sincerely before noticing the sapphire locket resting against Arthur's collar. His breath caught. He recognized every delicate engraving. He had commissioned that very locket for Rosaline during the first spring after their wedding. No duplicate had ever existed. Julian asked where Arthur had obtained such an heirloom. "My mother gave it to me," Arthur replied without hesitation. "She said it belonged to a happier chapter of her life and hoped it would remind me that kindness always outlives sorrow." The words echoed through Julian's mind long after. Arthur departed. Unable to dismiss the impossible coincidence, Julian quietly began investigating the physician whose compassion had preserved his life. Estate records, parish documents, and discreet inquiries gradually pointed toward one destination repeated again and again by grateful voices: Starlight House. Several days later Julian rode alone to the restored abbey. He expected perhaps a modest orphanage sustained by charitable donations. Instead he found flourishing gardens, busy workshops, classrooms filled with eager children, and mothers learning new trades with hopeful determination. Laughter floated through open windows like birdsong after rain. Everywhere he looked, people carried themselves with dignity rather than despair. The sanctuary radiated the warmth his own magnificent manor had lacked for years. Then he heard dozens of joyful voices calling across the gardens. Mother Rose. A graceful woman turned from the flower beds, brushing soil gently from her hands before looking toward the arriving carriage. Time itself seemed to stop. Rosaline's eyes met Julian's across 15 years of silence. Neither anger nor triumph appeared upon her face. Only quiet peace. She inclined her head with gentle courtesy. "Good afternoon, Your Grace." Nothing more. As Arthur and Lillian hurried toward their mother, Julian watched them embrace her with effortless affection. In that breathtaking moment he saw his own eyes reflected in Arthur's determined gaze, while Lillian's radiant smile belonged unmistakably to Rosaline. The truth arrived without accusation, without bitterness, and without mercy, leaving the Duke standing speechless before the family he had unknowingly spent 15 years mourning. Julian Blackwood left Starlight House carrying a burden heavier than any title he had ever inherited. The cheerful voices of children echoed behind him, but every joyful laugh only sharpened his regret. He had walked into the sanctuary expecting answers and departed with a truth so overwhelming that even the familiar road back to Blackwood Manor seemed unrecognizable. Arthur's determined eyes, Lillian's radiant smile, and Rosaline's calm greeting replayed endlessly within his mind. She had offered neither accusation nor forgiveness. Her dignity had become the harshest judgment he had ever faced. For the first time in his life, Julian questioned not only the choices he had made but the man he had allowed himself to become. The following morning, he summoned Mrs. Agnes Whitmore to his private study. The elderly housekeeper entered slowly, her silver hair neatly arranged beneath a simple cap. She had served the Blackwood family for nearly half a century, yet never before had she seen the Duke look so utterly defeated. He stood beside the window instead of behind his desk, as though the authority that office once represented no longer belonged to him. "I found Rosaline," he said quietly. Mrs. Whitmore closed her eyes. A single tear escaped before she managed a faint smile. "I prayed every day that truth would find you, my lord." Julian turned toward her. "Tell me everything." For several long moments, the old housekeeper remained silent, gathering courage buried beneath 15 years of loyalty and sorrow. Then, one painful memory at a time, she revealed everything she had witnessed. She spoke of Rosaline's lonely evenings waiting for Julian to return home. She described the countless attempts the Duchess had made to speak honestly with her husband, only to be interrupted by political obligations or Vivian's carefully orchestrated distractions. She confessed that the night Rosaline left, the young Duchess had not shed a single tear in front of anyone because she refused to let humiliation become her child's first inheritance. Julian listened without interruption. Every sentence felt like another stone added to the weight crushing his heart. Mrs. Whitmore then unlocked an old cedar chest hidden inside her room. Within it rested ledgers, servant journals, payment receipts, and small bundles of correspondence preserved against time. Together they formed a pattern too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. Several dismissed servants had accepted unexplained payments shortly after Vivian arrived at Blackwood Manor. Household inventories revealed priceless heirlooms disappearing one by one under forged signatures. More disturbing still were written testimonies from former maids describing how Lady Vivian ordered letters intercepted before they ever reached the Duke's study. Julian's hands trembled. "There were letters?" Mrs. Whitmore nodded. "More than 100. The words struck harder than any blade. Rosaline had written faithfully throughout her pregnancy, after the twins' birth, during difficult winters, and throughout the years that followed. She had begged Julian to meet her, not to reclaim wealth or position, but simply to know his children before bitterness poisoned every remaining hope. Nearly every letter had vanished before reaching him. Burnt. Destroyed. Silenced forever. Mrs. Whitmore carefully lifted a beautifully carved music box from the chest. "I could only save one." She placed it gently into Julian's hands. Hidden beneath the velvet lining rested a single folded letter, its edges yellowed with age but its elegant handwriting unmistakably Rosaline's. Julian unfolded it with trembling fingers. "My beloved Julian, if this letter reaches you, perhaps heaven has shown us mercy. Arthur smiled today for the first time, and little Lillian refuses to sleep unless I sing beside her cradle. Every time I watch them, I wonder whether they inherited your kindness more than your pride. I have never wished to punish you. Wished only that our children might know the father I once believed could overcome every fear. If you cannot love me again, then love them enough to meet them. That alone would be more than enough. Always, Rosaline." The room fell silent. Julian lowered the letter and covered his face. Years of carefully restrained emotion collapsed beneath the unbearable realization that Rosaline had never abandoned him. He had abandoned her. News spread quickly through London's highest circles when Julian announced a formal gathering at Blackwood Manor. Nobles, judges, businessmen, and political allies arrived expecting another grand social occasion. Instead, they found the Duke standing alone beneath the great staircase, his expression stripped of every trace of aristocratic pride. Lady Vivian descended elegantly, dressed in expensive silk and glittering jewels she believed would soon become permanently hers. She smiled confidently. Until Julian spoke. Before every distinguished guest, he presented forged financial records, sworn statements from former servants, hidden account books, and the surviving letter from Rosaline. One witness after another stepped forward to confirm Vivian's deception. The ballroom that had once celebrated her arrival now became the courtroom of her downfall. Vivian's composure finally shattered. She denied everything. She accused servants of conspiracy. She blamed jealousy, grief, misunderstanding, and misfortune. But truth possessed something lies never could. Evidence. As each document emerged, every excuse collapsed beneath its weight. The aristocracy watched in horrified silence while years of manipulation unraveled before their eyes. Friends turned away from Vivian. Political allies withdrew their support. Creditors demanded repayment. By sunset she had lost not only her influence but every illusion of respectability she had carefully constructed. She departed Blackwood Manor alone. No carriage waited. No farewell accompanied her. Only silence. Julian might have celebrated justice. Instead he rode directly to Starlight House. Rosaline found him repairing a broken wooden fence alongside several village craftsmen. Without ceremony he laid the surviving letter before her. "I failed every promise I ever made," he said, his voice barely steady. "There is no punishment equal to that knowledge." Rosaline looked at the worn paper before meeting his eyes. "I never prayed for your suffering," she answered softly. "Only your awakening." He lowered himself to one knee, not as a duke before his duchess, but as a broken man before the woman he had wronged. "I ask for nothing. No forgiveness. No place in your life. Only the chance to become someone our children need not be ashamed of." Rosaline studied him for a long moment. The pride that had once ruled him was gone. In its place stood humility earned through unbearable truth. "You cannot rebuild yesterday," she said gently. "But tomorrow still belongs to those willing to serve it." Those words transformed the remainder of Julian's life. He resigned from prestigious political offices that had once consumed his every waking hour. He sold treasured collections accumulated through generations and used the proceeds to rebuild neglected schools, establish rural hospitals, restore orphanages, and provide homes for widows abandoned by society. He worked beside laborers rather than directing them from horseback. Villagers who had once feared the Duke now knew him simply as a man carrying bricks, planting trees, and repairing roofs without seeking recognition. He never mentioned redemption, because he understood it was not something claimed with words but demonstrated through years of faithful action. One evening, as Arthur watched Julian helping children repair the old schoolhouse roof beneath the setting sun, he turned quietly toward Rosaline. A thoughtful smile crossed his face. "I think," he said softly, "he has finally become the man you always believed he could be." 3 years passed with the quiet certainty of changing seasons, and England slowly witnessed the transformation few had believed possible. Blackwood Manor no longer stood as a monument to aristocratic privilege alone. The estate had become a place where compassion outweighed ceremony, where servants laughed without fear, and where visitors arrived seeking hope rather than favor. The grand ballroom that had once echoed with whispered scandal now hosted annual charity galas benefiting widows, abandoned mothers, and orphaned children. The vast gardens, once reserved exclusively for nobles, welcomed children from every corner of the county, their joyful voices replacing the silence that had haunted the estate for years. Those who remembered the terrible winter of Rosaline's disappearance often paused in quiet wonder. It seemed impossible that the same home which had nearly destroyed one family had become a sanctuary for hundreds. Julian Blackwood never claimed credit for the change. He rose before dawn each morning, working beside gardeners, carpenters, physicians, and teachers without ceremony or expectation. The Duke who had once measured success through influence now found greater satisfaction repairing school roofs, planting orchards, and carrying timber for new cottages. He still wore fine coats when duty required, yet more often his sleeves were rolled above weathered hands marked by honest labor. People noticed the difference long before he ever spoke of it. Children no longer approached him with hesitation. Villagers greeted him by name instead of title. Even those who had once condemned him quietly admitted that genuine humility could accomplish what pride never would. Rosaline watched these changes without rushing her own heart. She worked beside Julian almost every day, organizing relief efforts, expanding Starlight House, and visiting struggling families throughout the countryside. Their conversations remained gentle and practical. They discussed harvests, orphanages, village schools, and medical supplies. Sometimes they shared quiet laughter over Arthur's endless determination or Lillian's spirited wit. Yet neither spoke of restoring what had once been lost. Rosaline had learned that trust resembled a garden. It could not be forced into bloom. It required patience, careful tending, and seasons of faithful care. Arthur observed them both with thoughtful eyes. As a physician, he understood healing rarely happened all at once. Bones mended slowly. Wounds closed one careful day at a time. Hearts, he believed, followed the same mysterious design. He admired Julian's refusal to demand forgiveness as much as he admired Rosaline's refusal to offer empty promises. Their relationship rested not upon forgotten pain but upon earned respect. One crisp spring morning, Arthur approached Julian carrying several young white rose bushes wrapped carefully in damp linen. "My mother always loved white roses," he said. Julian smiled warmly. "I remember planting the first ones together after our wedding." Arthur handed him a small garden spade. "Would you help me plant more?" For a brief moment Julian simply stared at the invitation. No grand speech could have carried greater meaning. Together they knelt beneath the bright spring sky, gently placing each rose into rich earth. Neither spoke very much. Words felt unnecessary while roots disappeared beneath fresh soil. Nearby, Rosaline watched from a distance with quiet emotion as father and son worked side by side beneath blossoming trees. She realized they were planting far more than flowers. They were planting memories neither had been allowed to share during Arthur's childhood. Summer arrived wrapped in warm sunlight and fragrant blossoms. Preparations began for the annual Blackwood Charity Gala, now recognized across England as one of the nation's most important charitable gatherings. Invitations were extended not only to aristocrats but also to teachers, physicians, craftsmen, widows, former orphans, village families, and every person whose life had somehow become connected to Blackwood's remarkable transformation. No distinction separated noble birth from humble beginnings beneath the restored ballroom's magnificent chandeliers. That equality reflected Rosaline's vision more than any written policy. Lillian had spent months preparing a special piano performance. By now her reputation reached far beyond London's concert halls. Critics praised her extraordinary technique, but audiences returned because every performance seemed to speak directly to the heart. On the evening of the gala she wore a graceful ivory gown adorned with tiny embroidered roses rather than expensive jewels. She wished nothing to distract from the purpose of the night. As guests filled the ballroom, many elderly attendees quietly remembered another gathering held within those same walls years earlier. They remembered a frightened pregnant duchess standing alone while society remained silent. Looking now at Rosaline greeting every guest with serene confidence, they understood how profoundly courage could outlast humiliation. The orchestra fell silent. Lillian approached the grand piano. Her fingers rested lightly upon polished ivory keys before music slowly filled the vast room. The opening melody carried quiet sorrow, recalling winters of loneliness and dreams abandoned beneath falling snow. Gradually hope emerged within the harmonies, growing stronger with every passing movement until triumph replaced grief without denying it had ever existed. Listeners wiped tears from their eyes without fully understanding why. The performance spoke a language deeper than memory. When the final note faded into silence, the audience rose together in thunderous applause. Lillian remained seated only a moment before standing. She looked across the crowded ballroom, toward her mother, toward Arthur, finally, toward Julian. The applause slowly faded. She smiled gently. Tonight is not about forgiveness. Every voice disappeared. It is about what love becomes after pride finally dies. The words settled over the ballroom with extraordinary power. Arthur stepped forward. Years earlier he had unknowingly saved Julian's life. Now he carried something even greater. He stopped only an arm's length away from the man who had spent 3 years quietly earning every fragile step toward redemption. Julian looked at him with uncertain hope. Arthur's expression softened. One simple word escaped his lips. "Father." Nothing else. Julian's composure shattered completely. Tears streamed freely down his face as he embraced the son whose childhood he had missed and whose respect he had never believed possible to regain. Around them, countless guests quietly wiped away their own tears. Servants who had remained loyal through decades of sorrow smiled openly. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore covered her trembling mouth, whispering a grateful prayer she had carried in her heart for nearly 20 years. Julian slowly released Arthur before turning toward Rosaline. He did not move closer. He simply stood waiting. The choice had always belonged to her. Rosaline walked across the ballroom with calm, unhurried steps. Every painful memory remained part of her story. She had not forgotten lonely nights, broken trust, or the storm that changed her life forever. Those wounds would always exist. Yet she also saw the man Julian had chosen to become through years of quiet service, humility, and sacrifice. He had sought neither applause nor absolution. He had simply changed. Without speaking, Rosaline reached for his hand. Julian looked down in astonishment as her fingers gently intertwined with his. Not because the past had disappeared, but because the future deserved honesty rather than fear. The ballroom erupted into joyful applause unlike anything Blackwood Manor had ever witnessed. There were no whispered scandals, no cruel gossip, only grateful celebration. Within months, Julian and Rosaline formally established the Blackwood Foundation, dedicating its wealth and influence to protecting abandoned women, educating orphan children, supporting widows, and rebuilding struggling communities throughout England. Starlight House became its heart, while Blackwood Manor became its home. Arthur directed medical programs that reached isolated villages. Lillian organized concerts whose proceeds funded schools, libraries, and shelters across the country. Every member of the family devoted their gifts to lifting others rather than preserving privilege. Many years later, visitors walking through the estate found thousands of white roses blooming where pride had once flourished. Children raced joyfully through the gardens, scarcely aware they played upon ground once marked by heartbreak. They knew only that an elderly duke always carried sweets inside his coat, that a graceful duchess never forgot a child's name, that a compassionate physician healed without demanding payment, and that a gifted pianist filled every summer evening with music. History remembered Julian and Rosaline Blackwood not because they possessed one of England's greatest fortunes, but because they proved that true nobility was never inherited through birth alone. It was earned through humility, restored through compassion, and measured by the lives forever changed through love. Beneath the blooming white roses they had planted together, hand in hand and surrounded by generations whose futures they had transformed, they discovered that the deepest wounds could never erase hope when two hearts finally chose grace over pride.